Welcome everyone. Good morning to our Pacific region participants and good afternoon to our participants on the mainland. My name is Kirsten Miller, Lead Communications Consultant at REL Pacific, and on behalf of all of us at REL Pacific, thank you for joining us for Facilitating Data-Informed Conversations, 5 Steps Forward. Just a few housekeeping issues before we get started. We have a fairly large group today, so we're keeping your audio on mute, but if you have a question, please use the questions and chat function, which we'll be monitoring throughout the webinar. We're also recording today's session, and we'll make that available to you following the webinar. In just a moment, I'll turn things over to our presenter, Dr. Miriam Baker, but first I'd like to introduce you to our work at REL Pacific and the REL Pacific context. REL Pacific at McREL is one of 10 regional educational laboratories, or RELs, funded by the Institute of Education Sciences, or IES. We serve educators in American Samoa, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, which include Chuuk, Koshrai, Pohnpei, and Yap, in addition to Guam, Hawaii, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau. At REL Pacific, we identify priority needs in the region through comprehensive reviews of education system data, interviews with education agency staff, and ongoing contact with the field, and support research alliances that bring together key stakeholders to work collaboratively to address problems and questions of high priority and relevance to Pacific education. I think we have a few Research Alliance members with us today. Welcome again to you. Our work focuses on 4 priority areas: teacher effectiveness, family and community engagement, college and career readiness, and optimizing data systems, which is our focus today. REL Pacific is housed at McREL International's Pacific Center for Changing the Odds, or PCCO, a private nonprofit corporation that draws upon the best of education research to translate what works into innovations and results. As you can see from the graphic, we do have a very large geographic span that we work within. It's quite geographically vast. Our 7 entities in the REL Pacific region include 1 state, 3 freely associated states, and 3 territories, covering 5 time zones and more than 935 islands. Our region is mostly rural and spans a geographic area larger than the entirety of the continental United States. All of our entities use English as the language of instruction, with 5 of the 7 also instructing in an indigenous language, including Chamorro, Chuukese, Marshallese, and Palauan. Just a little bit of information now about the guide that our webinar is focusing on, 5 Steps for Structuring Data-Informed Conversations in Action in Education. This guide was initially created as a technical assistance tool for our Research Alliance members, in effect a guidebook on how to bridge education data and practice. The applications of the guide, though, are field-wide and have the potential to empower education stakeholders across the Pacific and beyond. I'm going to now turn this over to Dr. Miriam Baker, our presenter today. She is the Director of Research and Evaluation at Knowledge Universe and a co-author of 5 Steps to Structuring Data-Informed Conversations in Action in Education. Miriam, the floor is yours.
Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that Wendy Kekahio and myself co-wrote this guide, and she was a fabulous contributor, and I'm honored to be able to be here today with all of you. The objectives of our webinar are to build your capacity for using data to drive decisions, action, monitoring, and evaluation. My assumption is that you are either currently in the position of actively using data to inform planning and decision-making in your educational setting, or that you're about to embark on such an effort. We structured both the guide and this webinar to be very clear and simple in order to build your confidence and skills in executing those efforts. The big message I would like you to hear is, yes, I can do this, and I don't have to be a researcher. That's really what we want you to do, is to be feeling empowered to do this work on your own. So to start, I would just kind of like to have a better sense of who's out there. I'm going to open a poll, and it will give you an opportunity to respond in terms of what your, how you identify yourself and your primary role related to this data work in your community. You can take a moment to please just respond which of those categories, which I know are not as detailed as they could be, you consider yourself falling into. Oh my goodness, so many, many, many more people that are identifying themselves as a researcher or an analyst than I would have expected. I'm looking at the real-time responses coming in. About 10% looks like school administrators and about 30% other, which makes me think we didn't have enough categories. I would love to know who folks are on the other, if anybody feels like putting that in the chat or question window. I'm going to close the poll. It looks like we have most everyone's responded. So again, it looks like the majority of folks identify themselves as researchers and analysts. Hello to all of you. 10% school administrators, 30% other, 3% teachers. No one identified themselves as a primary role as a parent or community member. So, data and data teams. Data is a word that I know makes many people nervous, although I'm guessing not this audience given the representation of the research community. But certainly everybody in any role they have uses data, whether you're aware of it or not. A teacher looking at a student spelling test and deciding to assign more practice is using data to make a decision. A community organizer looking at a report on the local economy and workforce and then building a program for youth employment opportunities is using data to drive action. Data is simply another word for information, and we all use it all of the time. So why the webinar? As individuals working to support quality education in your own region, state, district, or school, you know there's an increasing expectation to systematically use data to drive your decisions. Data can ensure that you are responding to the facts of the situation, which may or may not be consistent with what your eyes are telling you or what your gut tells you. We live in a time of increasing accountability due in a large part to policy changes at the federal and state level, and effective use of data is getting to be the norm. The good news is that there's a lot of great information out there already available. You don't necessarily need to, quote, collect data to have the kinds of conversations we'll be discussing today. In fact, my assumption is that you would use information already available through sources on the internet, such as the National Center for Educational Statistics, the RELS, IES, or your local community. So now on to data teams, which are not a requirement to do the work. However, having a group of individuals working together to answer the driving questions that you have can help to ensure validity in your conclusions. And what I mean by that is, with diverse perspectives, if your team comes to a common conclusion and a plan, you can feel more confident that it really is the right choice that's representing multiple points of view and not the result of a biased conclusion based on somebody's personal agenda. So I'm going to open up another poll here regarding data teams. I'm interested how many of you might be participating in a data team now? Okay, so we've got about half the folks have responded, and it looks like about 2/3 of you are in a data team now, and 1/3 are not. Okay. I'm going to leave the poll open for just a few more seconds to see if that changes. And closing it now. So as you can see, 65% said yes, they are on a data team now, and 35% said no. I hope that you're having a good experience in your data teams, those of you that are doing that. Okay, so on to the guide and the bulk of this webinar, the 5 steps. The 5 steps are, number 1, setting the stage. What question is to be addressed in this data-informed conversation that you're having? Number 2, examining the data. What patterns are revealed once you start looking at the information? Number 3, understanding the findings, or otherwise, what are the possible explanations for the patterns that you find? That's very important. And number 4, developing an action plan. So if you identify an issue that you want to work on, how can that best be addressed? And then the 5th step, monitoring progress and measuring success. How will you or the data team know if progress is being made? So the first step, setting the stage. This step identifies the question to be addressed, the information needed to answer it, and also the feasibility of accessing the information. Because we can all come up with great questions we'd like to answer, but the reality is we may not have the time, the money, the resources, or the source of information to answer it. So crafting clear questions is crucial for enabling data-informed conversations. The data team starts by framing the what question as simply as possible. So it can be very, very broad to start with, as in, what do the data tell us about middle school students' math achievement? But while it's important to begin by identifying a bigger issue, the question eventually needs to be narrowed down to be specific, which makes identifying and interpreting your data much clearer and easier. So answering a what question can lead to other kinds of questions, such as those that look at relationships between two things. So, for example, you might be interested in the relationship between gender and math achievement. So are boys or girls doing better on the same math test, or are they doing about the same? Or are other different subgroups that you have perhaps not doing as well as you would like to see? Perhaps youth of a particular heritage, youth that are highly mobile, could be a lot of different pieces. And you can also look at how other questions about how one variable may influence another one. So maybe you have a pilot program in your school this year that provides tutoring after school in math, and you want to see if that has an increase on math performance in that same measure. Keeping long-term goals in mind does help to ensure that your current short-term activities and goals are aligning with the larger mission of what you're working on. So again, even though we start with a broad issue, we want to try to narrow it down. Those things should be very much entwined. Defining clear short-term objectives that support long-term goals also contributes to a continuous data-informed conversation. Tracking long-term goals might also require data that are not currently being collected, and if you find that that's the case, that can initiate a conversation on future plans to collect information that you may not currently have. So, if anybody feels brave, I would love to hear from you in the chat window in terms of a question that you are working on, an issue that you are working on as you are looking at your data. If you feel like posting that just for others to see in the chat or question window, that would be wonderful. I don't see anybody posting anything here yet. Oh, what is the impact of accommodations on test results? Thanks for posting that. So that is an interesting question to ask. So I might use you as a little bit of an example as we go forward today. So continuing on with step one on setting the stage, we need to think about what information is needed, is it available, and the types of information that typically are available. So the sources of information, what do the data reveal about the math achievement of our middle school students? That was my question. Requires access to the results of some kinds of math scores, probably standardized math scores for middle school students. The question about the impact of accommodation on test results. So we need those test results. We also need to know which students have received accommodation. So there's a couple of different data points there. Some questions also require separating data into smaller groups of interest. So for example, the question on the relationship between student gender and standardized math performance would require that I separate my results by male and female. It's ideal to review data sources that have already been analyzed and reported, or secondarily those that are in raw form, that is from a reliable source like the Department of Education, school-level records or databases, and certainly the sources like REL and NCES. For example, some education agencies also issue annual reports on results that have already been analyzed by school level, by district level, and other groups. In that case, you really wouldn't need any further analysis. But if analyses have not already been done or have not been completed in a way that answers your question, looking for raw data would probably be your next step. For example, possible sources in my question about middle school math achievement include the Stanford Achievement Test, 10th edition, which I know is widely used out in the Pacific, or some other kinds of state or jurisdiction benchmark assessments. And actually, having just one data source might not be enough for your decision makers to have confidence in the results. You may want to look at several different types of results on math. Besides standardized test scores, you might also want to look at formative data that might be available at the classroom level to really be able to drill down to understand where success is happening and where challenge exists. So the types of education data typically used are demographics, which are descriptive about the population of interest. That includes things like gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and sometimes descriptors of your organization, including enrollment and attendance. Perceptual data or opinion data is typically surveys about how people feel or what they think. And that can be your stakeholders and what they feel or think about the program or the organization. It could be parents, it can be community members, students, staff. There's lots of different sources of perceptual data. Performance data tends to be more frequently used because that would be the outcome data, and that's where a lot of people want to drive to right away. How students are performing on their educational outcomes, assessments, grades, GPA, dropout rates, mobility rates, college and career readiness, et cetera, and so forth. Lots of different stuff there. And then finally, program data, which is not always attended to quite so much, but sometimes can help answer the question. Program data are descriptive pieces of information about how the educational program or activities are delivered in the organization. So that might be the curriculum that's being used, the textbook, the staffing ratio, the nature of the assessments used, the frequency, intensity, duration of your program. So all of that kind of information. So I would ask you now to do another poll. What kind of data do you typically use? And this is a check all that apply. So let me know what kind of data you use to answer the questions you're working on. Lots and lots and lots of folks use performance data, which is what I suspected. We've got about half the folks that have voted so far, and then I'll put the results up on the screen so you can see. Right now it looks like demographic data and performance data are most frequently used, which would be what I would expect. But I'm happy to see that there's a healthy percentage of you that are also using perceptual or opinion data as well as program data, because it really does help us to better understand our results. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and I'll post it up here for you to see. Oh, whoops, there we go. So now you can see how that came out. High percentage of demographic performance data, smaller percentage of programmatic data, but again, I'm very delighted to see that that's happening, and then some perceptual data as well. That's great. So step 2, examining the data. We're looking for patterns and making observations, and then exploring data limitations and looking at key strengths and challenges and what you find. That's really what's going to be driving your action plan. So looking for patterns in the data and making a snapshot observation is a first step toward answering these kinds of questions. For some questions, data on from one period in time, such as a test or a school year, may be sufficient. If your question is related to math proficiency for the current year, you just need results from the current year. But if I'm interested in how math achievement is looking over time, then I need several years. It's important to discuss any limitations that you see in your data, and what I mean by that is data are rarely perfect. Sometimes we don't have a big enough sample size to really generalize. If I only have 15 kids that did the test last year in my school, it's kind of difficult to take that small sample and say that that's going to be true for most kids in the school. Also, the data team should be considering whether different sources of data can be compared. For example, some test data are not designed for comparison across grades and years. That's why that increase in math scores in my example should not be necessarily considered a success. I need more information on the context. Similarly, data that are not the same, for example, SAT 10 scores and GPAs, can't be really combined together They can be looked at both as sources to answer the math question, but you can't really combine those results together to answer how do they do on a standardized test, for example, because it's apples and oranges. Such data need to be viewed separately as they convey slightly different information or perspectives on the question, but you can, again, use them to triangulate to create a body of evidence to answer your question. Additionally, while data can inform decisions and provide the first step in investigating relationships between programs and outcomes, relationships or correlations are not the same as a cause. I'll just say that again for those of you that are not researchers, because it's the first thing we learn when we go be researchers, is that cause is not the same as correlation. You know, if we have these middle school boys having lower math scores than the girls, for example, there's definitely a relationship between gender and math scores, but we wouldn't say that it caused it. We can't really come to that conclusion without a lot more evidence. So during the step of examining the data, it may be possible to begin to characterize findings from the data as strengths or challenges. Strengths are the results that indicate a success. Challenges are the results that indicate that something is blocking improvement. For example, again, with the middle school math achievement, a data team might make the following observation about a possible success. They might say, every year between 2009 and 2012, students showed a 5% point increase in average achievement scores between grades 6 and 7. So that's awesome. All of our transitional 6th to 7th graders, not all of them, but the majority of them are, you know, making this increase such that when we look at it across the whole population, there's this 5 percentage point increase. However, if they dug a little bit deeper, they might make the following observation about a clear challenge. While student math scores improved overall, the scores of male students showed a 2% point decline in the same time period. So there was a difference there, which is part of why it's important to look at those subgroups. Let's just stopping to see if anybody's posting any questions here. Oh, here's another research question. Is disability a cause of increased absenteeism of a student? So that's actually another great question to talk about cause and correlation. There would be some important information that you would have to find out, and it sounds like you're talking about maybe a student rather than a group of students, so that would be a little bit different way to go about gathering that information as well. So moving on to limitations. What kinds of limits are in the data that you are working with, if any? If anybody feels like being brave and posting that in the question chat window, what kinds of limitations do you struggle with as you're working with your data? I can tell you one of the big things that I have happen in almost every project is I have many, many, many missing cases. So, yep, small sample size, I was just going to say that. So it ends up, if I want to do subgroup analysis, if there's only 3 kids in one particular subgroup, I can't really do that. Can't really draw any conclusions. So we can see small sample size. Anybody else? Oh, here's one. Only one rater for qualitative data analysis. Yep, that's a good one, because with the qualitative data, a lot of how we determine that it's good, that it's reliable and valid, is by having several raters and having their inter-rater reliability be good. Vague definitions, that's a great idea too, because in education, when you're measuring constructs like, you know, how a student feels about something or how engaged they are, it's hard to define those things. Thanks for your responses, folks. Appreciate it. So let's move on to step 3, understanding the findings. So now you have these results, and what do they mean? Important to remember that results don't exist in a vacuum, and what I mean by that is that, you know, as you all know, I'm assuming you are all somehow connected to education. We have these kids for, what, 6 hours a day, and then they have this whole life that goes on outside. You know, we are looking at, if we want to just look at the performance objective, at the math scores, what all goes into that? Well, literacy is really important to math. There's lots of different factors that can be happening, so it's important to really be looking at the big picture. So a key step in understanding the data results is to begin a discussion among your data team members or with some colleagues about one or two key challenges that you've identified. Understanding why the challenges may be occurring can help address them and might also affect the findings related to your original question. So a review of the data often reveals several challenges. It's usually not just one. The data team seldom has the time or resources to explore all of them, so you really have to focus on just a few or maybe just one. Some challenges will be more actionable than others and might have a higher or lower administrative priority. It doesn't help to pick a challenge that you cannot impact, for example, or you have low probability of impacting, such as, I don't know, parent attitudes about homework. I mean, you can work on that, but you probably can't have as strong an impact on that particular challenge as you might be able to affect as something that you can do in the school day, in the school building. Actionable challenges have driving factors that educators can address or influence directly, just as I was saying. So one way to identify driving factors for a key challenge, and thus to the extent to which it's actionable, is to ask a series of questions followed by responses. I'm going to show you a visual of this process that is in the guide. So you've identified here, You've identified here the key challenge. The number of middle school students who meet or exceed proficiency on math standardized tests has declined during the past 2 years. So this is clearly a challenge. Why? The first question is, why have these scores declined? So this schematic kind of takes you through this process of trying to ask questions to drill down to these possible driving factors. The data team can then begin to consider those driving factors behind the challenges by understanding the facts and making basically an educated guess. Now, it's important to stick to the available facts. Opinions and attitudes can bias how data are interpreted, and data teams need to remain as objective as possible. So, coming up and saying, well, I remember when my son was in school, his teacher never helped him with his math homework, and that's why he did really bad. Although it's an interesting case study, that is something that happened to you in the past, and we need to base our decisions on what we see right now in terms of empirical findings that are consistent. So again, looking at this just briefly, I know you can read this on your own. Potential driving factor, why have test scores declined? Well, maybe students spend less time on math topics each year. Okay, well, why do they spend less time on math topics? Potential driving factor, because math topics were not integrated throughout all subjects as in earlier years. Now that may be behind it. Well, why were they not? Because cross-subject team meetings were held less frequently. So this is leading you down to the real potential driving factor that might be causing these declining scores, going through very logically and just challenging why. Why is that? Why was that decision made? Why did this happen? Why did that happen? Can lead you to a set of factors that you can actually influence. Okay. Step 4, I'm going to just look over here at the questions again to see if anybody's posing questions that I need to answer now. It doesn't look like it. Lots of great limitations people have listed. I really appreciate you putting those out there for folks to review. Okay, step 4, developing an action plan. The action plan is to help to impact those challenges that we've identified and promote success. And the first part of the plan is to identify key stakeholders who would be involved. For example, if the jurisdiction or school has identified the math achievement of male middle school students as a key challenge, many people will need to be involved to effectively address that issue. Without the support of key stakeholders, even the best plan is unlikely to succeed. So in this case, stakeholders might include school principals, curriculum and instruction folks, specialists, assessment staff, teachers, parents, could be others. Careful planning helps data teams take the right actions to tackle the challenges they have identified. Planning really is worth the time. Action plans typically include short-term objectives and a long-term goal. So circling right back to where we started, You need to have the big picture in mind, but you've got to break it down into small, achievable pieces, those short-term objectives. Having a long-term goal will help to make clear what the plan hopes to accomplish in the end. You know, your blue sky statement about what you're doing, what your mission is, maybe is to ensure that all children in the Pacific region are ready for college and career. That's a huge statement that can be broken into many, many, many smaller goals and objectives. Clarity and agreement on objectives and goals can be improved by using something called the SMART goal, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but it's an oldie, but it's a goodie. So SMART goals, it's an acronym, stand for goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. So specific, again, this is identifying exactly which people are involved, what is the goal going to accomplish, where is it going to happen, when is it going to happen, you know, what do we need to make it happen, and why is it important. Measurable goals allow progress to be tracked and help identify steps toward achievement. So measurable, you have to figure out how you're going to measure it. Now with the SATs, if you're going to do those, it's kind of difficult because it's year to year, but maybe your milestones to track improved math scores is a more formative measure if your school uses something like that, something that's more frequently given to students that you can start to see an upward trend on. Attainable, well obviously the goal has to be attainable. If it's too big and there's not enough resources to do it, then it's not going to be worth your time. So make sure it's something you can really do. Relevant. So again, it needs to be important. It needs to be related to that bigger issue. It needs to be something that's going to move you forward. And timely. So all goals should include a time frame. You know, we're going to collect the scores on this date. We're going to have the analysis done by that date. We're going to have a team meeting on this date to discuss if they've gone up or down and why. This is another template that's in the guide, and it's just actually a worksheet that you can use with your group. It's very user-friendly, so it's got the SMART pieces up at the top, and then just a few questions for you to discuss with your group to help you to develop that kind of a goal. What resources are required? For example, if you wanted to find out about the causes frequently and math is not integrated as well into the curriculum, what are we trying to do? We're trying to bring that back. Is that our goal? So if that's the goal, what resources are required? Do we need more time? Do we need more money? Do we need to change the superintendent's mind? I'm not sure what we would need. So really just talking through what resources are required. What are the dates? You know, if you're trying to get those groups to be meeting and having that curriculum saturated across topics with math, when does that need to happen by so that teachers can go to work? Does it need to be by the middle of the summer? The milestones, so, you know, for that example, again, is it convincing the superintendent by this date, setting up the meeting schedule by that date, changing the school schedule by another date, and the activities. So kind of a lot of overlap there. But again, this is just a resource for you. Strategies and actions are really the foundation of an action plan, and once they're determined, the resources and reasonable time frame can be identified. So really think about your strategies and your actions first. Think about data availability. Think about the relevance in terms of this affecting that driving factor. Is it related to our goal? Okay, and then I have another template to show you. Whoops. Which is also in the guide, looking at developing an action plan. So organizing your team for action. Now that you've kind of figured out what your SMART goal is and you know what needs to be done, you really need to assign a person because these things don't happen on their own. And it may be you're the person and you're doing all these things on your own, but if you have a team, you know, go ahead and step through it and say, okay, the first thing we need to do is get a meeting with the superintendent to convince her of how important it is to have teachers in these cross-departmental meetings. We've got to get that back. Who's going to do that? Well, you know, I know her pretty well, so let me do that, and I'm going to do it by this date. Do I need any resources? I need a little write-up of this data that we just looked at to show her. That's my resource. So it doesn't have to be a novel, but just jotting down, the key steps that you need will help you to stay on track with your plan. Last step, monitoring progress and measuring success. That's in order to keep your action plan on track, and measuring success is to determine, has our goal been reached? Are we done? Data team members should regularly revisit the action plan. If it gets off track, perhaps through dropped responsibilities or staff turnover or some other unforeseen challenge, the team should troubleshoot to determine what to do to get it back on track. And let me tell you, they get off track a lot, so it doesn't mean that you're bad if your plan gets off track. It just means you have other things to do. So, but it is good to have a regular meeting cadence, some way to check in to make sure that you're progressing. And maybe you'll need to adjust some timelines or responsibilities. But don't just create the action plan and put it in a file someplace. It should really be a living document. So as I said, team members should regularly check in with one another, identify challenges, be honest, make changes as needed, celebrate your successes. Yeah, the superintendent said yes, that's great. So then, how do you know when your goal's been reached? Assessing progress is essential in using data to achieve desired improvement. As an action plan is being implemented, it's important to assess whether its strategies are being properly executed and its goals are being achieved. Some action plans will be short-term and lend themselves to quick evaluation using school-level data systems. I think the whole example I was just talking about would be one of those. Either you're going to get that policy changed and get the teachers back that time to do cross-departmental discussion and planning, or you're not. Other action plans will be more long-term and may require more time to implement, such as strategies that rely on the annual standardized test outcomes. If your goal is to move the dial on the percentage of students that are proficient or above by 10%, that may take a few years. That might be a 3-year goal, and you want to see at least 3% growth a year or something like that. When assessing the effectiveness of an action plan, the data team should collect the same type of data from the same data source used to identify the challenge or the success. So for example, if you identified the challenge by using the SAT-10 and said, we have this gap for our young men, and then, a year later, the school district changes and now you're using the Terra Nova, that's going to be a problem because those scores may not relate unless you can find some evidence that suggests that they highly correlate. When data are from different sources, the differences in how data were collected could yield different results. Evaluation like this, what you're doing in your work, provides opportunities for your team and colleagues to observe the results of your efforts. When data team members see positive impacts on student achievement, when you see you're making progress, I know I don't have to tell any of you this. That's just like the best day of your year, isn't it? It's like, wow, it's working. It really motivates you. It strengthens your resolve. It strengthens your commitment. And frankly, I like to share that kind of stuff with the stakeholders, with the students, with the parents, with the teachers to let them know that too. It's very motivating. In addition, evaluating the effectiveness of the strategies and actions in which you've been engaged allows you to determine what's working and what's not working. If actions and strategies are not working, the teams can adjust them. And again, the action plan should be a living document that you look at all the time, that you're really saying is guiding the work that you're doing in that area. You may need to tweak it as things change. Policies change, assessments change, curriculum changes. So keep it alive. So, in summary, educators make decisions every single day that affect the students in their classrooms and in their systems. Using data to inform those decisions helps ensure that they are guided by available information, grounded in factual observations, and lead to better outcomes for all. So that is my summary and presentation. I'm going to give this back to, to Kirsten if I can figure out how to do it. Oh, she took it
Thank you,
back. There we
Miriam.
go. And
Thank you,
if you
Miriam.
have, sure.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
if you have questions, I'm just going to say post them in the window there, and we'll get to them.
Thank you, Miriam, for that great presentation. Bear with me for just a moment here while I pull my screen back up. So there have been some great questions, some great audience participation throughout the webinar. And we have left a little bit of time for additional questions, so I'm going to give you a moment to go ahead and type those into the chat box if you have any more questions for Miriam. In the meantime, I'd like to let you know that we will be emailing a survey about this event out to you in the next few days, and we'd really appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to let us know how we're doing and how we can better serve you in the future. Just going to give a few more minutes here for any additional questions to pop into the chat box. It looks like we've got one. Miriam, we have a question. How do we know when the results are, in quotes, bad enough for us to choose the result to take action on, and how do we decide when it's a challenge?
Well, and I would say that is something that your stakeholder group needs to help you answer. And the reason I say that is because it depends on what's important locally. For example, I think about a program I worked with a long time ago that targeted youth that were court involved, middle school and high school youth that were court involved. They uniformly had a D average or below. Their academic success was not great. One of the things, we knew that we needed to act on it, but in terms of what our milestones were for a benchmark for success, were very different than I would have picked for like overall 7th graders. Overall 7th graders, I might have said, wow, if they are below a B average in this particular school, that's something we need to work on. We want to pull that up. We want everybody to have a B or better. But in this particular subgroup of students, where they were was so much lower. It wasn't the original actionable item, but I guess what I'm trying to say is it depends on the context. So that's the value of dialoguing with your data team. I'm not sure what your role is, but if you're a teacher and you're having trouble in your classroom with some students and it seems really bad, I would be wanting to know from the principal, like, what are we looking like overall as a school? How is that related to a district? To poke around in there. I don't think there's a textbook answer. It would depend on what your question is, if it's about academics in particular or something else. Sorry to be vague on that, but that's the best. I would just say talk to your colleagues about, what those big priorities are.
Miriam, it looks like we have another question here. I apologize. I think you probably heard me say uh-oh because I lost your audio for a second there. But our next question is what if the data team is different from the implementation team? How does one team monitor the other? That seems politically difficult.
Oh, that's a great question. How interesting. And there's no overlap between the two? I'm assuming not. I would say, in my work, I have a lot of siloing, and my solution is I just go and pound on the door and make myself a part of their team. I would think that at a minimum, there needs to be one person from each of those groups that is part of the other so that they have a bigger understanding. I would say when I think about an implementation team, I'm not sure, what you're implementing, if you're implementing a curriculum or what it might be, but I think it would be very important that they understand the data that you are using to measure their success and that they agree with it. Because as implementers, they actually may have a better measure to recommend to you or an additional measure. So I would say try to break down those walls if you can and share your knowledge and expertise. Because I tell you, I always try to work with developers while I'm designing a research or plan or an evaluation. because it makes no sense to me for them to design the curriculum and then 8 months later I come in to evaluate it when I don't have any idea of their research base or what they think is important or who are the teachers that are going to be putting it into place. So I would say try to collaborate if you can.
All right, well, we have another question here. This one's from Brenda. How do you encourage team members to stick to the data rather than use opinion or anecdotal information?
Years. I spend a lot of time trying to do that. I always try to validate what people are expressing to me when they say, well, you know, I really think it's this and I really think it's that. One of the things is, you know, if you have to demonstrate change, if you have to demonstrate improvement, what I would say to the data team is, you know, while I value your opinion and your experiences, we need to collect empirical data so that we can show our change, and hopefully that change will be consistent with what you're observing. Because, I mean, often I think results should make people nod their heads, like, I knew it was that. But the reality is, you know, opinions they just don't have the same value in this world of education right now as they used to. I think that you can have an opinion, but you can still use data.
All right, and we have one final question here for Miriam from Scott. Miriam, Scott asks us if you can tell us what Knowledge Universe does, what your company does.
Oh, well, thanks for asking, Scott. So I'm the Director of Research and Evaluation, and Knowledge Universe is a company that owns several educational lines of business. The biggest one that's probably most well known, although not in the Pacific, is KinderCare Learning Centers. That's early childhood birth through school-aged, center-based KinderCare. That's what KinderCare is. We have 1,600 centers across 39 states. And we also have a program called Champions, which is a school-aged care that's typically provided in a school, like before and after school care, summer breaks, that kind of thing. And then we also have something called Children's Creative Learning Centers, or CCLC, and that is a partnership where we bring in a child care center into a large employer's campus, like university, or like out here in Colorado where I office, we have Martin Marietta. So those are the three different work streams that we have, and I oversee the design and implementation of all of our ongoing internal evaluation assessments, and also using the ongoing formative kinds of things that we have to inform our teacher preparation programs so that we know that teachers are getting everything that they need to have to be successful in the field, and as well as working very closely with our Director of Curriculum Development to make sure that we're getting everything in there that we need to get in there. So that's what Knowledge Universe does. And they are headquartered up in Portland, Oregon.
All right, it doesn't look like we have any additional questions. So thank you again, Miriam, for your presentation, and to all of our audience members for their participation today. On this final slide, you can see where you can contact REL Pacific for additional information or requests for resources or technical assistance. And again, we'll be sending a follow-up email with a link to materials, and along with that, with the survey for this event. Thank you once again for joining us. If there's no other questions, then this will conclude our webinar.